We're so very grateful for you listening and joining us on No Small Endeavor. In 2024, NSE reached some exciting milestones. This year, we moved from being in the top 10% of podcasts to the top 1% of all podcasts, while being aired on more than 40 public radio stations around the country. And thanks to many of you voting for us, we received our first prominent industry award, a Silver Signal Award. I like to think that these achievements reflect our continued commitment to our mission. This work only matters if it contributes to your life and to the shared life of our cities, families, and communities. And it only matters when you are a part of the mix. So we thank you. I also want to take a moment to thank our outstanding production, management, and marketing team, because we most definitely could not do NSE without them. They do such a stellar job, and I'm super proud to work with all of them. Christy, Jacob, Sophie, Tom, Kate, Mary Evelyn, Carrie-Ad, Jason, Audrey, and Tim. To sustain and expand this work, we're turning to you. Specifically, we're asking you to become an NSE Plus subscriber, because we depend upon such revenue to make NSE possible. You can choose the monthly amount, starting as low as $5 per month. Consider making it $10, $20, maybe even $100 per month. In exchange, you get lots of perks like ad-free listening, exclusive content available only to NSE Plus members, and pre-sale access to tickets for live events. And you'll get a sense of contribution knowing you are helping sustain work that's seeking to sow beauty, truth, and goodness into the world. So if you will, please go to our website, nosmallendeavor.com, and click Join NSE Plus. Many thanks. Hello, friends. We are excited that our No Small Endeavor Plus community is growing. Now, all of our friends in the No Small Endeavor orbit are intelligent, smarter than average, winsome, good-looking, while the members of NSE Plus seem especially so because they are enjoying ad-free episodes as well as special subscriber-only content once a month where we discuss habits and practices learned from our guests over the years. And those special episodes have been a lot of fun, personal and practical. I love sitting down with our producer, Jacob Lewis, and recording those for you. And so we would love to have you join us. And your NSE Plus membership helps support the show. So because of all of these things, we'd love for you to join the NSE Plus family. Just go to nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up on our subscriber-only episodes today. Again, go now, nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up. See you there. Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is one of our unabridged best of episodes with Oliver Burkeman, author of the New York Times bestseller 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. This is one of those interviews and books I have continued to ruminate on in a healthy way, I think, since having had the interview and read the book. I think that especially his insight about paying attention to pain and the way that may actually reduce suffering has been one that has especially stuck with me. You'll get that in the third part of the interview, I think it is. And just generally speaking, his counsel to learn to pay attention to life and the beauty of the fact that life is, that rather than obsessing quite so much about the circumstances of life, to simply receive the gift of life itself as the gift it is, in fact, is. And that was a terrible sentence, but I think you know what I meant. Anyway, enjoy this interview unabridged with Oliver Burkeman. Oliver Burkeman is the author of the New York Times bestseller 4,000 Weeks, which we'll be discussing today. He's also the author of other books, including The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Cannot Stand Positive Thinking. For years, he wrote a popular column for The Guardian entitled, This Column Will Change Your Life. In his email newsletter, The Imperfectionist, he writes about productivity, mortality, the power of limits, and building a meaningful life in an age of distraction. And he lives now in the North York moors. Welcome, Oliver.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Hi.
It's a delight to have you. I love your book, and I think one of the reasons I love your book is that you confess being a sort of productivity geek, and I too confess to that. And you and me both, for example, getting rather obsessed with people like David Allen's book, Getting Things Done. Mm-hmm. But how do you get from a book on, how do you get to this current book from being obsessed with productivity?
Well, I think it's a pretty straightforward journey, really. But it's the kind of journey where you come to the end of a trail and then you need something else, right? I think what happened was that I had explored kind of every productivity technique going, read every book. I was writing a column, as you mentioned, for the Guardian newspaper. One of the things I got to do was to try out all sorts of different systems for trying to get in control of my time. And I think there's actually that phenomenon, isn't there, where it's precisely because you do get to try everything out and none of it brings the kind of salvation that you were looking for, just to get immediately theological here. It's precisely because you do get to do that that you can have maybe some new, fresh thoughts or a different perspective that I'm trying to communicate in this book. If I hadn't gone all the way down that rabbit hole, I might still be here thinking that, next week I was going to find the perfect system. And there is a little part of me that still hopes that next week I'll find the perfect system. But
yeah. You open up saying early on in your book, you say the world is bursting with wonder, and yet it's the rare productivity guru who seems to have considered the possibility that the ultimate point of all our frenetic doing might be to experience more of that wonder. So how do you, is it simply for you that sort of getting to this sort of frustration that you got a lot done, but in getting a lot done, you weren't getting more important things done?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the symptoms, right? One of the things that happens if you really put a lot of effort and discipline into becoming more efficient at processing your tasks, or so I discovered anyway, was that you get really, really good at doing the least important things. And you also discover that because the supply of those tasks is effectively, infinite for us in this era anyway, you don't get to the end of them. So all those plans for kind of getting on top of one's email, for example, just lead to the sense that you're answering far more email, getting far more email, because that's what happens if you reply to a lot more email, and sort of absolutely not getting anywhere closer to what it was that you thought you were chasing. And I think another part of this, we can come to it later maybe, but I think another part of this is that I think a lot of us, certainly me in those days, feel a very strong desire to kind of, get on top of, be in control of our time. It's that sort of desire to somehow dominate, not necessarily dominate anybody else, but to, be in the driver's seat of our lives, I suppose, in a way that, in a way that firstly doesn't work for all sorts of reasons, but secondly does have the effect of kind of squelching out the wonder and the awe and the joy.
Yeah, it certainly does seem to be, in my experience as well, that the better I got at doing more stuff faster, that indeed there was this endless supply. And you even begin to get a reputation, right? That the more stuff you can get done, then the more people feel free to ask you to do X, Y, or Z. And it's a sort of endless productivity trap, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't end because, as I say, like firstly, the supply is infinite, and you don't get to the end of an infinite supply, and then actually the act of getting through the supply can generate more of it. So it sort of ups the tempo at which you do things. But if you just up the tempo at which you do things without getting to the end or focusing on what matters the most, that's just called being busier and more stressed. So yeah.
It reminds me, we recently did a interview with Rebecca DeYoung, who's a theologian, on the 7 deadly sins, and I was reminded of her description of the so-called sin of sloth, where typically we've thought of sloth as being lazy with regard to productivity.
Yeah.
But she notes that historically sloth was thought of as inattention to more important matters, or inattention to relationship, or inattention to the meaning of life. And it's this ironic sort of thing in which it may be actually our obsessions on productivity might lead us toward unexpectedly sloth.
I think that's a fascinating angle. It immediately reminds me of the idea that I think comes from more of a Buddhist tradition that one of the forms of laziness is busyness. That sort of not exerting a certain kind of I don't know how to talk about it, but not exerting a certain kind of agency or discipline over over one's actions in that way, or a kind of mastery, is to have like not done something rather than doing all the things. It's actually sort of it's a failure in some sense, or a falling away from the ideal path. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So early in the book, you make the argument that we in the contemporary world think of time in ways quite different than, say, a medieval peasant might have thought about time. So can you describe that difference for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's all sorts of things that have changed over the decades and the centuries, but I think the most fundamental thing that I wanted to try to articulate was the sort of very idea of seeing time as a thing at all. That's the kind of very non-technical phrasing that I use in the book. This sort of alienated, the sense we have today that there is me, and then there is my time, and it's some sort of resource that I have to use, or it is a little mental timeline that's always ticking along beside me and I'm trying to keep up with it, or it's something that I need to maximize the value of. All these ideas about having a relationship with time, which and for most of us these days is some form of adversarial relationship most of the time. But the very premise of a relationship, obviously, is that there are two things here: me and time. And I think that the direct daily experience of a medieval peasant and many other people at different points in history would have been what anthropologists call task orientation instead of time orientation. It would have just been that time was just the medium in which you lived. It would have been that, there was no sense that you had the power to sort of step outside of this flow and manage it, control it, change the level of efficiency with which you were approaching it. One of the sort of needles I try to thread in the book is, I think that today, the times that we feel this way are those kind of moments when the clock falls away, when we feel like we've stepped out of time. These often happen in sort of prayer or meditation, or in wonderful natural landscapes, or at the birth of a baby. Or, they tend to happen at these very peak moments. The point I'm trying to suggest is that I think there was a time, I think there's good reason to believe that there was a time in pre-industrial cultures when most, if not all of life, would have been lived in that vein, which is not to say that it wasn't absolutely terrible in all sorts of ways, right? It's not that everyone just went around as if they were at some wonderful moment in their lives, but that the one problem they didn't have, while they had all sorts of problems to do with illness and disease and injustice and a million other things, one kind of problem they didn't have was time problems, right? That sense of being overwhelmed, of trying to fit more things into your time than you have the time available for, of feeling guilty about wasting time. All these different things are all premised on this idea that there's you and that there's time, and this is somehow something else, and you've got to deal with it instead of just be it.
And then you indicate that the Industrial Revolution becomes a key turning point towards the change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, that it's very hard to sort of unpick causality directions here, and I don't really even try. But there's very obviously lots about the Industrial Revolution that requires a kind of third-person, objective, agreed-upon idea of time. You can't coordinate shifts in factories or transportation networks. Without that, you get the spread of, actually starting before the Industrial Revolution, you get the spread of public clocks, and the idea that you might see the time when you were out in the market square or something. It wouldn't be the same time as at the next village over, that wasn't until sort of the railroads started to did the biggest job of synchronizing those. But there was nonetheless this idea of, time other than just the flow of life. And yeah, I think that all gets much, much more pronounced as a result of industrialization. I think there are other reasons why it's become even more sort of acute just in the last few decades, because of certain kinds of agreed upon boundaries between work and non-work and leisure and the Sabbath versus working days and all these things were obviously persisted far, far beyond the 19th century. But yeah, I think industrialization was a big part of it.
Talk to us more about what you see as other contributing factors to the exacerbation of this. You even use the language, I think, of seeing it as a social contagion. So what are some of those other factors that contribute to this sort of frenetic instrumentalization of time?
Well, these days, I mean, it's always hard to unpick the role of kind of economic forces and political forces versus technological ones. It does, and as I say, I don't actually, in this book, at the stages of the book that you're talking about, I'm more trying to paint a picture of how it is rather than claim that I know, who or what's to blame.
Yeah.
But I think, digital technology is a really fascinating case here, because digital technology really just supercharges all of these things. It provides us with these absolutely unprecedented capacities to do things in an unlimited way, both or less limited way, I should say, both in terms of the number of messages we can send, the distance we can send them in no time at all, the information we can access about events happening thousands of miles away. But of course, while that seems to hold out the promise that, okay, at last we could get on top of our stuff and answer all the emails and know about all the things we wanted to know about happening in the news, pretty obviously it does two things at once, right? It allows us to take in a lot more of the world and to exert more control over the world, at the same time as it massively, massively extends the amount of the world that we even know about, that we even hear about. So email is, it's a great way to answer lots of messages fast, but you wouldn't get so many messages if it wasn't for email, right? So there's this constant back and forth between, as I put it in the book, I think, technology promises to help us get on top of everything, but it never works in the end because it always is expanding the size of the everything that we're trying to get on top of.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me of a book written by a Quaker, I think it was the 1930s, entitled A Testament of Devotion. But I remember he has this passage where he's talking about mass media, and he makes the claim that the human was not designed, created, didn't have the capacity to deal with the onslaught of information foisted upon the human by mass media. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's the 1930s.
Right.
So when you think about that, how much that's changed in the last 90 years, which of course, I think is precisely segues into at least what I see as one of your fundamental arguments that you're making in the book, and namely that we refuse to accept finitude, or that our struggle with our finitude is causing us deep anxiety. And that's one of the reasons that we're so drawn toward this sort of frenetic pace or this frenetic desire for productivity. So talk to us then about that major move in your book, about this call to an acceptance of our finitude or acceptance of our limitation.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and I think this happened for me through sort of a personal experience of this, right? I mean, and it was for me through all this productivity nonsense. It happens. I think, the struggle with finitude is pretty universal, but the articulation of it through being a productivity geek is just one flavor of it. But it's this sense, that this dawning realization that my efforts to get control of my time were sort of an attempt in some way to not accept the truth about what it is to be a limited human being, to have a limited amount of time, which means that there's going to be more things that matter than I'll ever get to do, to have limited knowledge, limited control. I think something that's going in the back of the mind of many people obsessed with productivity is the idea that one day they will get to a place where they're sort of emotionally invincible and they can handle any bit of work that's thrown at them and it's all completely smooth sailing. And yet, of course, being vulnerable in relationships and not being able to do everything that is asked of you and having to make tough choices about what you're going to do, these are just built in. They're just they're just hardwired. Yeah. And I think that they're just structured into our situation. And so as I began to look through this lens, I found more and more contexts where it seems clear to me, but also echoed in the work of many philosophers and psychotherapists and psychoanalysts and all sorts of people, that so much of what we do that adds to our suffering and gets in the way of our living the most meaningful lives we could it seems to have its roots in this idea of like not wanting to feel fully what it's like to be finite in all the ways that we are.
Yeah, you have one point you say, all this illustrates what might be termed the paradox of limitation, which runs through everything that follows. The more you try to manage your time with the goal of achieving a feeling of total control and freedom from the inevitable constraints of being human, the more stressful, empty, and frustrating life gets. But the more you confront the facts of finitude instead and work with them rather than against them, the more productive, meaningful, and joyful life becomes. I wonder, what sort of feedback have you gotten from folks about what sort of criticism, I guess, or naysaying have you received in response to that kind of claim?
That's a great question. Obviously, it's in the nature of this business that you mainly get commentary from people who resonate and respond positively because the other ones don't contact you. And some people who do, I will get to the actual criticisms, but some people who do, I think, and have appreciated the book, use words like they find it confronting. I think it's there's an element of what I'm doing here, which is in a hopefully witty and approachable way, dumping a bucket of cold water over the reader's head in certain ways, and hoping. I think this is important to show that actually the end result of that is peace of mind and relaxation. It's not a kind of like life is so short, so you better stress out massively trying to force meaningful activity into every second. I guess the couple of sort of pushback arguments there are, one that is something that people in sort of business world and startup world especially have, which is, isn't it only by trying to break limits and do the impossible that we ever achieve anything really splendid and meaningful as humans? Isn't there a benefit in sort of aiming for to do the impossible? And I have a response to that, which has to do with what we really mean by the impossible, and pointing out that the greatest inventors and entrepreneurs and life and world-changing reformers, did not spend all their days trying to answer every single message that came into their inbox.
Right.
And then I guess the other part of this, which might be of more interest to you, I don't know, from the theological perspective, is like, well, where's the role for the infinite in what I'm saying? I don't think what I'm saying about human finitude is at all incompatible with the idea that there is something infinite that is relevant to the fate of humans. But I definitely don't really go there in the book, right? I'm just sort of focusing on the fact that we are finite. I think that certainly from a religious perspective, I think some people definitely want to say like, okay, but do we not partake in something infinite as well? So that's a whole other dimension.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely is another dimension, but perhaps counterintuitively, it's not one I'm particularly interested in discussing at the moment, at least, because I think that I think it's so helpful to have you confront us with this sort of this life that we have. It is, in fact, finite, and I was thinking, for example, as you were describing that, Thomas Merton, the famous 20th century monk, Catholic writer, has one passage in one of his meditation books where he talks about the immensely frustrated person who is trying to wring every last bit of perfection out of every moment that he lives. And, it's like, I thought, well, that's what Oliver's saying, right? It's that we get to this point of exasperation, being unable to live life well when we have this sort of perfectionistic instrumentalization or obsessive focus on productivity with every moment.
Yes, but I don't know that particular Merton line, and I'm fascinated by that because you're right. I'm making the same critique, but actually, one of the sort of one interesting response to the book, or maybe more to the title, because some people sort of read the title and realize the 4,000 weeks is a reference to the average human lifespan, and then sort of freak out. One of the ways you can go with this, and you see this in the culture in general, not just about my book or anything, is that life is short, and therefore you have to wring something really, really, really stupendous out of every moment. And there is a kind of a modern version of that kind of carpe diem philosophy that I find personally just incredibly stressful. It's like, oh no, I've got to do this as well. Come on.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to stay on top of things here. And I think that is a sort of I always think of that as sort of the conclusion you'd get if you sort of went halfway with what I'm saying here, because hidden inside that desire to kind of live the most stupendous life is a kind of backdoor quest to overcome the human situation, right? There's a kind of a backdoor way of saying, well,
right,
maybe I can't live forever, but I can do things in the limited time I have that are so stupendous that it's almost a proxy for living forever somehow.
Right. Yeah, I'm currently on sabbatical from my university appointment, and I'm finding myself having to be very conscious. And your book turned out to be immensely helpful in reading at the start of a sabbatical, because my natural tendency would be to try to cram my sabbatical full of all sorts of every moment full of something stupendous, right?
Right.
And and I do plan to travel, and I do plan to get to visit with a lot of folks. But it's helping me reframe the notion of, in terms of things like sabbatical, namely Sabbath, rhythms of rest,
right,
rhythms of social connection, rhythms of friendship, and to maybe have just a little bit more breathing space to pay attention to the things that really do make life meaningful, as opposed to cramming them full of more consumerist experiences that the productivity side might foist upon me.
Yeah, it's fascinating, especially as you point out with the word sabbatical. But it's I don't know if you're finding this, but one of the things I'm always struck by is like it's the overproductive sort of cramming in mindset that comes most naturally to us or at least to many of us as modern people. It feels more comfortable in a way to take that route, and in a strange way, more comfortable to be stressed out. That's a very curious thought, but I think it is probably true. And so, if you're anything like me and you're in your situation and you decide to like deliberately not do that and to open up margin and space and time for friends and time for, walking in the park, whatever, it's kind of going to feel a bit uncomfortable at first, right? It's strange, and it's hard to sort of stick with it when you sort of allow yourself to rest, and the first thought you have is, oh, I'd rather be doing something more constructive.
Yes, yeah. I know that you've written a previous book on perfectionism, which I've not had the opportunity to read, but it seems like that sort of notion certainly fits into kind of some of what we're describing at this moment, sort of, in my mind, again, a perfectionism about wringing the most out of every moment. But how do you see your work on perfectionism relating to this conversation?
I guess, yeah, that is one of the themes in the positive thinking book. And then I had a collection of my Guardian columns that came before that, that sort of dwelt on some of that as well. I guess I do think that that's a sort of one way of describing all the things that I'm interested in is this drive in us, certainly in me, to achieve something sort of final and perfect in that way, whether it is, the perfect merit of a piece of creative work or the perfect efficiency of a organized life or anything like that. And sort of the constant need to reconfront the fact that perfection does not exist in this earthly reality. It's not there. It's a sort of mental framework that we try to impose on the world, and that according to by relative to which the world will always be found wanting. And I think I've always felt this in myself. It's like I remember I definitely have those tendencies, and I remember as early as my it's a cliche that at sort of university entrance interviews in the UK anyway, when people ask you like, what's your greatest fault? It's great to say, oh, I'm a perfectionist, because it's kind of like it's not a fault. It's like you're saying, well, my greatest fault is that I'm totally brilliant at everything. It's like it's a totally bad faith way of bigging yourself up, and humble bragging, we would call it these days. But I've felt like, but I've been aware, I was aware ever since that sort of age, late, young adulthood, that it was actually, it's just a bad thing. It's like it's not actually something to be proud of. It doesn't lead to me doing my best work, and there is that sort of perpetual straining to make the world line up to how it feels like the world ought to be. And so, I think it's all sort of, you can see it all as some version of perfectionism. And then, I call my email newsletter The Imperfectionist, because I feel like that's what I'm trying to preach, but also, internalize. As always, it's in both directions. It's rather, it can certainly contribute to a rather neurotic sort of life, right? And I think for me, at least one of the roots of my perfectionism, of which I'm still recovering, is my own kind of religious tradition, which can be, that really ramps up the perfectionism when you feel like you're having to constantly attend to the demands of a perfectionistic God. And if you don't, there's sort of eternal damnation sorts of consequences, which obviously is quite unhealthy. Right.
But one of the things that has helped me a lot kind of philosophically is in my appreciation of the virtue traditions, where they substitute typically the notion of excellence as opposed to perfection.
Right.
And so excellence, that's striving to grow in the capacities to envision a sort of flourishing life. But it's tricky because, in my experience, it's been tricky because, for example, the virtue of magnanimity, which at its best is saying, I'm striving for all parts of my life to continue to grow towards what it looks like to be a flourishing human being.
Right.
Under a perfectionistic sort of standard, that can become its own sort of neuroses, right? But if on the other hand, magnanimity keeps hearing the kinds of things you're telling us, such that a flourishing human life really means learning also to have space for rest, to have space for reflection, to ask questions about what are the most important things about life to be focusing on, as opposed to this sort of incessant, mindless productivity, then in that regard, it becomes very helpful, because it's not a breathless, I've got to grow, as much as it's a sort of invitation to as you say in your book, leisure, which is right in the Greek philosophers, is this question about, well, what is the meaning of life? Hello, friends. An important housekeeping announcement regarding publishing. We currently release our normal edited podcast episodes on Thursdays, the unabridged episodes the following Tuesday, but due to the principalities and powers that be in the podcast industry starting in the new year, we are switching it up. New edited episodes will come out every Monday, and the unabridged version will release Friday of the same week. So start your week with the edited version on Monday, end it with the unabridged on Friday. So new year, new rhythm, same exploration of living a good life. See you on a Monday soon. Thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. And one thing it's reminding me of is this thing that I've noticed a lot is that, perfectionism, or just, whatever are your old conditioned ways of doing things, are always trying to sort of come and co-opt the new way of being, right? The moment you can embrace a tradition that you find helpful, and then find that the same old forces are trying to get you to embrace it perfectly. And
right, yes,
I saw a email newsletter titled by a great a woman called Catherine Andrews, who writes a great newsletter called The Sunday Soother, who gave it this very ironic headline, something like "You're going about recovering from perfectionism all wrong," or something. That sort of that idea that we're going to try to be perfect in our someone who, like me, sounds like us, who is sort of comes to a certain point in life. You then think, well, okay, from now on, I'm going to be completely different in a much more sort of self-forgiving and restful way, and I'm going to do it completely perfectly. And that's just the same thing by the back door. The other thing, and I'm not a super expert on those the virtue traditions at all, but like, there's something there that is more useful than it. I think this idea of letting go of perfectionism is not just about it's not about like turning down the dial and no longer aiming for 10 out of 10, but aiming for 6 out of 10 instead, right? It's something more to do with aiming to be wholeheartedly and fully human, rather than trying to somehow get out of being fully human. And I find that a very helpful frame, because it does just seem to me like, certain of these limitations are built in to my being a human. So, it's about not trying to escape that, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very well said. So I want to kind of turn now in the towards more the latter part of your book, with sort of constructive possibilities in dealing with the problem that you've described there. And I first want to begin with your appropriation of Martin Heidegger's notion of being, which I found very helpful, because I found myself reminding myself of that after I read you describe that repeatedly over the last couple of weeks. And that is this notion that, as I hear you saying from Heidegger, right, rather than this sort of constant questioning that we so typically do of asking why are things the way they are, and our grappling and our frustration, perhaps out of our perfectionisms about things not being the way we want them to be, instead to look with wonder at the fact simply that they are, or that we exist. And that this gives us a different sort of frame towards wonder as a posture, as opposed to a perfectionistic stance about the way things are. But is that fair enough description of what you're getting at there?
Yes, it is. I think that anyone claiming to say what Heidegger was saying needs to hedge it about with a lot of caveats. So I'm not going to say, if there's Heidegger scholars in the audience, they may not agree exactly, but no, that's what I take, which is, yes, one of the things I take, sort of do what I want to do with, rather than necessarily staying true to Heidegger. But it's the fact that any of this is if you train your attention on that for a moment, is the sort of direct path to some kind of wonder, right? Because when I step out of the house where we're living now in the very, very beautiful part of the countryside, which has no light pollution, and see the stars, like then it's very easy to feel awe and wonder, because it is this sort of extraordinary sight and an extraordinary environment to be a part of. But actually, there's nothing non-extraordinary about sitting on the subway or, going to the grocery store. Like what, from the perspective of the idea that any of this is at all, it's possible to be really filled with astonishment by that. And I mentioned very briefly in the book an anecdote told to me by somebody else who lost a close friend sort of unexpectedly young, and found himself after that experience of bereavement, asking like what his friend would have given to experience the things he was experiencing, even if those things were waiting in a long traffic jam or being on hold to a annoying customer service line or something. All these things that life is full of are sort of not pleasant in terms of their substance, but the fact that you are doing them and that death could take them away puts a different spin on it all.
Yes. Yeah, I think I was sitting in a favorite tap room when I read that passage in your book. And I found myself then just sitting for a while, looking around at the people in the room, and considering how amazing it is, right? That I exist, that they exist, that we get to enjoy the craft of beer together in this room, and the wonder of life. It's a beautiful, very practical gift, I think, that you give us with that of learning to look with wonder, and the reminder to do that. Another sort of practice that you suggest is the art of creative neglect and or getting better at procrastinating. So talk to us about either one of those.
Yeah, I mean, that pretty much amount to the different angles on the same thing. I mean, I think all the way through this book and other stuff I do, I'm much less kind of trying to say, why don't you do things this way? And much more trying to say, like, this is how things are. And so there's something really empowering and freeing and meaningful about stepping into a full sort of awareness of that, or a little bit closer to a full awareness of it anyway, which is also a Heidegger related thing. But so this idea of creative neglect or getting better at procrastinating is just to say, it is a fact about our situation that there will just always be vastly many, perhaps arguably infinitely many more meaningful uses for any period of time, an hour, a week, your whole life, than you'll be able to do in the time that you have. So it will always be the case that, huge amounts of potentially legitimate and fulfilling and wondrous uses for your time are being sort of abandoned. Every decision we make at every moment of life is a waving goodbye to countless other alternatives. And I'm just pointing to ways, I think, of sort of approaching that situation a bit more consciously, instead of what we generally do, which is to try to sort of build structures of belief or indeed productivity systems that allow us to go on thinking that we don't have to make these tough choices, and to sort of let yourself fall into the reality of those tough choices and that fact that everything is a trade-off and everything carries an opportunity cost. At that point, you can start to make slightly wiser choices about what matters the most to you. Because, in the extreme case, if you are a proponent of some productivity system that makes you believe there's going to be time to do everything, then you're going to choose to do all sorts of things that don't really matter to you enough to spend your precious time on them, because after all, you're going to get everything done. So what's the loss? And so, yeah, I think that's just the idea I'm trying to get at there. And this idea of becoming a better procrastinator, which that phrasing originates with a writer called Greg Kretsch. And he sort of makes the point that, we're always procrastinating on almost everything at any moment. If procrastination means not making progress on something meaningful. So really seeing that as an art form and saying, well, every moment is going to be saying a no to almost everything. So how can I do that in the most graceful and wisest way? It makes it a little bit more approachable than eliminating procrastination entirely, which is, a rather tougher call.
Yeah. And I read it as a not an invitation to carelessness as much as quite the opposite, right? An invitation to paying attention to what we are paying attention to. And I did find the repeated surfacing of the notion of attention that comes throughout your book very important, which has been a topic that's been discussed in interesting ways in theology here in the last couple of decades of, for example, the language one well-known American theologian, Jamie Smith, has popularized of, you are what you love. That is, you are what you give your attention to. Yeah. And you have this beautiful line from the Catholic poet Mary Oliver, who says, attention is the beginning of devotion.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit more about this notion of attention.
Well, I guess it's sort of the central way of talking about our finite time is to see the way that time is sort of how it is just a question of what we pay attention to, and that our lives, people talk about attention being a finite resource, especially in the modern sort of attention economy, where it's a resource that various companies want to monetize. But that always seems to me to slightly underplay how central it is. It's not really something we use to live our lives so much as it just is our lives. And if you never pay attention to a given relationship in your life at all, could you really be said to have that relationship in your life at all? Likewise, if you have a certain problem that you literally never think about, it would be difficult to say that it was really a problem for you. So, yeah, I think that idea from Mary Oliver that sort of you have to attend to things in order to care about them at all, and the fact that our attention is finite, not only because our lives are finite, but in any one moment we can only really pay attention to, depending on how you read the neuroscience, but basically to one thing at a time. It just goes to the core of all this, and it becomes very clear, at least to me, how sort of casually I had treated my own attention, and how there's a serious sort of responsibility, one might say, especially these days, to sort of think about what is happening to my attention and do what I can to steward it well.
Yeah. You tell a story in this vein about Steve Young, a young man who wanted to be a Buddhist monk.
Yeah.
Could you tell that story for us?
Sure. He's better known these days as Shinzen Young. He's a sort of celebrated teacher of meditation from a very sort of really quite a sort of secular scientific perspective these days. But he trained to be a Zen, a Shingon Buddhist monk. Long and the short of it is, he was obliged in the mountains of Japan to undergo this purification ritual where 3 times a day through the winter he had to dump icy water from a cistern onto his naked body. And first, this just seems like some sort of terrible form of torture. Why are they making me do this just to become a monk? But and he writes about and talks about gradually learning that the more attention he paid to the sensations, the more he could hold his attention on the sensations that he was experiencing, the less suffering there was. Although you might think it's the opposite, right? You might think that if there is some fact of your life that is distressing to you, that trying to sort of run away from it mentally would be the way forward. And that he found was associated with more with more suffering. A friend of mine who's a meditation teacher puts it in another way and just says, like, in order to suffer in life, in order to find your situation unpleasant and annoying and stressful or whatever it might be, you have to have some mental bandwidth left over for that complaining. And actually, if you can train the attention to be more and more, ever more fully in and on the experience that you're having, then that there's less bandwidth to sort of find it the cause of suffering. And Shinzen Young writes about seeing that this was actually a form of meditation training. It was a training in concentration to sort of, with a reward of not being so distressed by the icy water if you did it well, and the punishment, a sort of Pavlovian, it's like getting electric shock or something if your attention wanders. And so this prompts a kind of hypothetical thought, certainly nothing that reflects my own experience, but it's a hypothetical thought that I think some meditation teachers might endorse, and I don't know where it might take us, but that in principle, any experience could be in life that life could bring could be sort of fully suffused with wonder and meaning and absorption if we could hold our attention on it absolutely, completely. That there might be no emotional experience, however terrible, that was the cause of suffering, if we were if we were fully absorbed in it. I'm not there yet.
Yeah, it's hard. It's very difficult, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, as you were describing that, Viktor Frankl's famous book about his experience in the Holocaust, and his argument, at least, that one still has the freedom to ascribe the meaning one chooses towards any given experience. And in my mind, it's helpful. And I don't know what the sort of approach you were describing would say about what I'm about to say, but in my mind, it's helpful for me conceptually to draw a distinction between a given social condition that I would want to describe as horrific or evil, while on the other hand, drawing the category of an individual or a group of people choosing how they're going to respond or the particular attention that they're going to give to it. Mm-hmm. But this fascinating notion that by paying attention to, in this case, the Buddhist monk in training, to the pain of the cold water exposure, thawing water exposure, it's fascinating to think about giving more attention to that suffering or to that pain. Reduces the suffering. I just find that remarkable. Of course, I also find it fascinating because years ago I started doing cold water exposure myself with cold showers.
Right.
And it's been fascinating the ways I've learned about my own mind and my own thinking through that sort of process.
Yeah.
Any other closing thoughts about that particular conversation, though?
I mean, no, I think that sort of nails it. It's this. For me, it all ties together with this thought that there is something incredibly powerful about anything that we can do to sort of lead ourselves more fully into our experience, and that there is this kind of notion that what we need to do is hold back, or we need to contain it, we need to get in control of it, otherwise it might destroy us. And actually experiencing doesn't destroy us, right? And that, I mean, I suppose, except in certain contexts where it might. The mind wants to come up with hypothetical thought experiments. But, it's like this notion that stepping fully into the experience of being human is something we sort of can't afford to do because it will be too awful is repeatedly belied by experience.
Yeah. I liked a moment ago where you said that in thinking about sort of constructive practices, you're trying to avoid this sort of notion of, coming up with a sort of to-do list or 5 successful steps to overcome what you're talking about, which I think is quite helpful to point us toward posture or point us toward practice or point us toward a different sort of attention. But you do close the book with 5 potential questions that we might ask ourselves, as well as 10 potential practices that might help us step into living the sort of way you're pointing us towards. So could you talk about what might be some of your favorites among those 5 questions or those 10 practices as we kind of move toward the close?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the questions are the part I was sort of happy to realize that was the way to end this book, that it could get quite specific and practical for readers without me engaging in this sort of laundry list of, here are the 6 things you should spend your time on to have a meaningful life, which would sort of violate the whole thing. Then the techniques at the end, I mean, I'm a little bit more ambivalent about because, if they work for you, that's great. But I also think people are easily smart enough, having sort of imbibed some of this perspective, to come up with their own ways of instantiating it in their lives. I guess one of the questions I'm not going to remember the exact phrasing, don't have the book in front of my eyes right this second, but is the question about, where in life you're waiting to get started on, to dive into the things that matter the most to you until it's the right time, until you're fully qualified, until you can, until you know what you're doing, basically. And I've found it, repeatedly, astonishingly revealing in life. I think many people go through some version of this to realize that, that everyone is in a sense making it up as they go along. That that we're all together in being just on the leading edge of this moment and next moment, and like actually nobody knows what's coming a moment from now, and we're all sort of improvising. Certainly, a good surgeon is improvising on the basis of some serious training, and a good airline pilot has, is not just sort of making it up in a certain sense. But in another sense, I think we all are, and there's something very liberating about that realization that the moment of truth isn't coming. That this is the moment of truth. That that this is it, and that if you're going to do things in your life that you care about, at some point it's going to be now that you do them. I think it's incredibly easy to get into that perspective that says real life will get started soon. And then I think it gets progressively harder to cling on to that notion the older you get, right? Because it's
right.
You can believe it at 20 in a way that you can't believe it at 40.
Yeah. The wording you have here in the book, in which areas of life are you still holding back until you feel like you know what you're doing? And another one, going back to what we had earlier, are you holding yourself to and judging yourself by standards of productivity or performance that are impossible to meet? And that's one that really deeply spoke to me. I started learning to get over some of that, 3, 4, 5 years ago, but it's an immensely helpful question, right? We hold over ourselves some sort of set of criteria that are just from the start impossible. And yet, again, your book is this invitation to let go of this impossible set of criteria over ourselves.
Yeah, and I think it's worth just noting something that people want very reasonably to push back there and say, well, it's all very well for you to say, but I do need to do an impossible number of things in order to keep my life going. Or more often they're talking about notional people who are not them, but who are people much less privileged than them. What if you have to do an impossible amount of work just to keep the roof over your head and keep food on your children's in your children's stomachs, and and it's a subtle point that I always want to try to make in the right way, but like the answer to that is that nobody can successfully complete impossible demands. And if it's really true that you're going to get fired unless you do the impossible, then you're going to get fired, right? And that's might well be an indictment of the society that we live in, but it's not a reason to keep on trying to find a way to do the impossible. And so I think it's important to say, because I think that everyone's situation varies massively, but even if you can't take on board these ideas and sort of revolutionize your life circumstances, or even if you don't want to take them on board and use them to revolutionize your life circumstances, there's a very important internal shift, which I think is at the core of all this, which is about saying, I'm not going to make my sense of like self-worth conditional on being able to do something that is systematically impossible for a human being to do. Maybe I'm going to still have to keep answering a huge number of emails from my boss or dean or whatever that I'd far rather, just ignore and that are not in themselves are meaningful. Maybe I'm going to make the calculation that continuing to do a bunch of this stuff is the right thing to do given my circumstances. But I'm not going to sort of collaborate with these forces of making these impossible demands and say like, yeah, I'm only going to feel good about myself when I can answer 50 emails an hour, because you can't do it. So might as well start feeling good about yourself now, right. and then and then do what you can to deal with that situation.
Yes. Yeah. So one last question that's two-part as we close. One is, when you, after completing this sort of very helpful book and invitation to life, after having written these things, at what point do you still look at your life and think, I'm not yet living into what I've described here yet in the way I want to? And then give us an example of a way in which you find yourself in a moment of wonder or gratitude, and you think, yeah, this is what I'm trying to describe, and I'm grateful to be in this space at this moment.
Yeah, I think it's, excuse me. One thing of writing a book like this will really do is make you absolutely acutely aware of the sense in which you are a work in progress and have not got there. And I do sometimes, I think I'll actually seriously do this one day. Like, I'll do some event or podcast or something, and I'll like interview my wife and get her to be like unsparing about how relaxed with respect to time and how open to life's vagaries she really thinks I am. Because I think it's, that is the ultimate kind of accountability, isn't it? And she does find it amusing to advise me to read my own book on not too infrequently. But I mean, I think I have a pretty good. To me, this is not actually, when you get to the bottom of it, this is not actually a sign that I'm a terrible hypocrite and my ideas are all superficial. It's precisely those things that you struggle with that you're interested in as a writer, right? I mean, it's like it's you're not going to be interested in exploring things that just come really easily and naturally to you. So there's plenty of it's all relative. I am a much less anxious person than I used to be, and still a pretty anxious person. I am much more able to sort of spend absorbing time with my son and my wife without sort of cycling through work stuff. But on the other hand, this book did quite a lot better than I expected it to, and the challenges and the opportunities and the sort of pace of all that has increased. So it's its own challenge, and so it's a constant kind of back and forth between those things. In terms of some time when I feel like I'm doing it right, I suppose. I'm not sure that was exactly your phrasing, but we moved from Brooklyn to the North York Moors. I'm deeply love Brooklyn, and I'm not saying people should all move to the countryside, even if they're in a position to. But for me, being surrounded by this landscape, this rather bleak moor landscape, acts. I'm really proud of us for having made this this move, because it's the kind of thing that one talks about and doesn't actually do. And it's the kind of landscape where, I just feel it's funny because it goes along with feeling very small in the landscape, but there is a real sense of like, there's a real sense of showing up for life somehow. And some aspects of the community life are also very sort of make you feel very much more sort of, I think there's some plus points to being slightly more dependent on your neighbors and on the people in the surroundings. So all of that is something that I cherish and value quite a lot. But it's, I mean, in no way am I some absolutely perfect handler of all time-related stresses. Then again, if I was, that would be perfection, wouldn't it? And that would undermine my argument. So.
Yes, indeed. We've been talking to Oliver Burkeman from his home there in England. Oliver is the author of the New York Times bestseller 4,000 Weeks. Oliver, thanks so much. It's been a delight to talk to you, and thank you for the moving and immensely helpful book.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSE Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSE Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriot Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Medium LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.